A heavy pickaxe smashed through the dirt. Sparks flew. Dust shot up in a thick cloud. 72-year-old Martha Thorne dropped to her knees in the rubble. She brushed away decades of grime with her bare hands. Where there should have been only rot and pipes, something metal gleamed. Cold steel, a heavy handle, a sealed vault buried under a building nobody had entered in 30 years. Her hands were shaking. Now, listen closely. Just 4 days earlier, this grandmother had bought this crumbling ruin for $4,200. Every last cent to her name. The whole city thought she'd lost her mind. But what she pulled out of that bunker made the most powerful men in the district absolutely terrified. Stay with me on this one. $4,200. That is the exact threshold where mathematics stops being a tool for planning and becomes an instrument of survival. For Martha, this specific sum represented a final, brutal calculation. It was the total liquidation of her remaining earthly assets. Every savings account, every sold piece of furniture, every cashed-out insurance policy culminated in this singular figure. The traditional housing market offered a simple, fatal equation. Average rent in the district required an upfront deposit of $3,000. Moving expenses consumed another $800. Basic utility deposits demanded the remaining $400. That left exactly zero for sustenance. The math guaranteed a slow starvation followed by inevitable eviction within 60 days. Martha ran the numbers endlessly in the glow of a cracked laptop screen. The spreadsheet offered no salvation. The economic system was designed to filter out anomalies like her. She was facing absolute, imminent displacement. She needed a structural loophole. The municipal tax auction listed properties the city considered deadweight. Lot 73 was a collapsed brick shell on the extreme industrial fringe. The roof had caved in during the winter of 2009. City inspectors classified the site as a severe public liability. The demolition schedule was stalled indefinitely due to massive municipal budget deficits. The opening bid was exactly $4,000. The remaining $200 would perfectly cover the transfer taxes and county filing fees. Martha bought the ruin on a rainy Tuesday morning. She traded her last liquid capital for a hazardous liability. There was no safety net left. Her bank balance dropped to zero. She now possessed a stamped piece of paper granting her absolute ownership of a hazard zone. The reality of the property was stark. It possessed no running water. The electrical grid connection was severed decades ago. The perimeter was breached in a dozen places. Wind howled through the shattered masonry. Stray animals used the exposed basement access as a den. Society views a condemned building as a terminal endpoint. Martha viewed it as raw, unmonitored material. The city saw a permanent blight. She saw a sanctuary entirely immune to rent hikes and landlord whims. This was not a real estate investment. It was a desperate defensive maneuver. Moving in required immediate tactical choices. Martha bypassed the collapsed upper floors entirely. The structural integrity above ground was compromised beyond repair. Rotted timber hung precariously overhead, threatening to drop at any sudden vibration. Her focus shifted downward. The original blueprints from 1922 indicated a reinforced sublevel. The facility was originally built to store heavy manufacturing solvents. The concrete down there was 3 feet thick. It maintained a constant damp temperature of 55 degrees year-round. Getting to it meant navigating a dangerous labyrinth of collapsed brick and rusted iron. Survival required strict energy management. For a woman of her age, every calorie expended had to yield a tangible result. Martha pitched a heavy canvas tent inside the main floor wreckage just to block the biting wind. She rigged a rudimentary rainwater catchment system using discarded industrial tarps and plastic buckets. Security meant fortifying a single point of entry. She spent her first 3 days barricading the shattered ground floor windows with reclaimed cinder blocks. Exhaustion became her constant baseline. She slept in short, fitful bursts, listening to the building groan as the temperature dropped. The vulnerability was extreme. A single severe storm could easily collapse the remaining eastern wall. An unexpected city inspection could result in immediate trespassing charges. Despite her legal deed, the building codes explicitly forbade habitation in structures lacking basic sanitation. She was an owner, yet simultaneously an illegal squatter on her own land. She lived entirely in the blind spot of municipal oversight. The city forgot about Lot 73 because it generated zero tax revenue. Martha relied heavily on that institutional amnesia. Her survival depended on remaining utterly invisible to the outside world. The $4,200 bought her a temporary pause from the crushing weight of the city. It bought her the concrete shell of a forgotten era. It bought her the crucial time needed to dig deeper. The surface was uninhabitable. The real work lay buried beneath the rubble. An anomaly lay buried beneath the foundational concrete. It required 30 years of deliberate obfuscation to remain hidden. Martha struck the edge of this secret on her 4th day of clearing the lot. The surface debris served as a perfect, chaotic decoy. Layers of rotting timber and shattered brick masked the true challenge below. The environment fought back against every swing of the tools. Invasive elm roots had woven themselves through rusted steel mesh. The soil was severely compacted by decades of urban neglect. It felt less like dirt and more like low-grade asphalt. Martha worked in a strict grid pattern. She divided the 30 by 40 foot plot into manageable squares. Progress was measured in grueling inches. She used a heavy iron pry bar to lever out chunks of masonry. Blistered, aged hands gripped splintered wooden handles. The air tasted constantly of pulverized mortar and dry earth. She tackled the organic layer first. Knotweed and sumac formed a dense, stubborn canopy. Their roots gripped the rubble with absolute tenacity. Martha used a heavy machete to hack through the thickest stems. The green wood bled a sticky, foul-smelling sap. She dragged the brush to the curb in massive bundles. Beneath the vegetation lay the architectural skeleton of a forgotten structure. Shattered cinder blocks, mixed with charred roof joists. Rusted nails protruded from rotting planks. Martha brought in a heavy steel wheelbarrow. She loaded it with broken bricks and plaster. The iron wheel sank deep into the soft, ash-filled dirt. She laid down wooden planks to create a stable track. She pushed the heavy loads back and forth for hundreds of trips. Her aging muscles burned with a dull, constant ache. The physical labor was a brutal necessity. By the end of week 2, the loose debris was finally gone. She hit the hard pan. This layer was a compressed mixture of gravel, glass shards, and dense clay. Rain had cemented it into a solid mass. A standard shovel proved completely useless. Martha switched to a heavy pickaxe. She drove the steel into the ground, letting gravity do the work her shoulders couldn't. It chipped away small, stubborn flakes of earth. The vibration traveled up the handle, rattling her aching joints. And then, just like we talked about at the beginning, the pickaxe smashed through the dirt and struck something that wasn't stone. A sharp, metallic ring. Martha knelt and brushed away the dirt with her gloved hands. A patch of smooth gray surface appeared. She poured water from her canteen over the area. The liquid washed away the dust, revealing high-density concrete. She expanded the clearing outward. The concrete stretched in all directions. It was perfectly level. This made no structural sense. The surrounding buildings were late 19th century brick structures. Their foundations consisted of loose fieldstone and soft mortar. This slab was entirely modern. It was poured with industrial precision. There were no expansion joints. There were no visible seams. It was a monolithic pour designed to seal the earth permanently. Martha calculated the volume. Hundreds of cubic yards of concrete lay beneath her boots. The cost would have been astronomical. Someone had spent a fortune to cap an abandoned residential lot. She spent the next 3 days crawling over the massive slab. She tapped the surface with a steel hammer. She listened intently to the acoustic resonance. Most areas returned a solid, dense ring. Near the northern perimeter, the pitch suddenly changed. It became slightly hollow. Martha focused her efforts there. She used a wire brush to violently scrub the concrete. A faint outline slowly emerged from the gray expanse. It was a perfect square, 3 feet by 3 feet. The square was a heavy access hatch. It was sealed shut with an industrial-grade epoxy. Martha bought an angle grinder and 10 diamond-tipped blades. The noise was deafening in the enclosed courtyard. Sparks cascaded over her boots as the blade bit into the hardened seam. The epoxy melted and smoked. It smelled strongly of burning plastic and ozone. She cut through the entire perimeter. The hatch remained stubbornly locked in place. She needed extreme leverage. She drove forged steel wedges into the cut groove. She used a 10-pound sledgehammer, relying on momentum rather than brute strength. She hit the wedges with measured, rhythmic strikes. The concrete groaned under the immense pressure. A sharp crack echoed across the empty lot. The chemical seal finally broke. Martha wedged a 6-foot iron pry bar under the thick lip. She threw all her frail but determined body weight against the steel bar. The heavy slab tilted upward. She pushed the hatch aside. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. A square of absolute blackness opened in the ground. The air that rose from the shaft was freezing cold. It lacked the damp, musty smell of a typical urban cellar. It was perfectly dry and metallic. Martha clicked on her tactical flashlight. The bright beam pierced the darkness. A galvanized steel ladder led straight downward. The heavy rungs were bolted directly into the concrete shaft. Martha climbed down carefully, her arthritic knees protesting the 15-foot drop. She reached the bottom and turned around. The flashlight beam swept across a massive subterranean room. The walls were lined with thick steel plating. Support columns marched into the distance, bearing weight calculations stenciled in faded black paint. The air was perfectly still. Dust lay undisturbed on endless rows of gray metal filing cabinets. The 30-year obfuscation made perfect sense now. The surface ruin was merely a locked door. A sealed leather ledger and a collection of faded black and white portraits held a dark secret. Together, they mapped the precise coordinates of a vanished municipal economy. Martha wiped the grime from the heavy cover. The binding cracked sharply in the silent basement. The pages inside smelled of dry rot and iron gall ink. This was not a forgotten diary. It was a master record of systematic extraction. Rows of handwritten figures filled the yellowed paper. The dates spanned a single, crucial decade of the city's history. The methodology of the theft was chillingly simple. Local infrastructure funds did not just disappear. They were carefully guided into a labyrinth of phantom corporations. The ledger listed these entities in neat, cursive script: Sovereign Trust, Apex Holdings, Meridian Supply. None of these companies ever poured concrete or laid brick. They existed entirely within the confines of a filing cabinet. They were financial vessels designed specifically to catch diverted capital. Money meant for the district flowed into these accounts through municipal grants. Then, it vanished across state lines. The audit evasion tactics were rigorous. Martha found bundles of cross-invoiced receipts tucked between the pages. Sovereign Trust would bill Apex Holdings for consulting fees. Apex Holdings would invoice Meridian Supply for material transport. The money moved in a rapid, circular motion. This created a dense fog of fake expenses. By the time city inspectors reviewed the ledgers, the original public funds had been washed clean. The capital was legally untraceable. The photographs provided the public faces of this operation. Martha spread the portraits across a makeshift table. She studied the subjects. They were not wealthy industrialists or bankers. They wore the rough clothes of laborers. One man held a dock worker's hook. Another wore a street sweeper's uniform. Their names, written on the backs of the photos, matched the board of directors for the shell companies. Someone had harvested their identities. The men likely never knew they were listed as corporate executives. Signatures on the attached authorization forms confirmed the deception. The ink strokes were heavy and uniform. A single hand had signed for a dozen different men. The loops and angles of the letters betrayed a careless arrogance. The forger did not even try to mask their handwriting. The scale of the drain became apparent as Martha turned the pages. Early entries recorded transfers of $2,000. Later pages showed single movements of $50,000. In total, over $4 million had been siphoned away from the public trust. This capital flight happened precisely when the neighborhood began its rapid decline. The economic collapse was not a natural market shift. It was an engineered vacuum. One specific entry detailed the municipal tram expansion project. The city had allocated heavy funding for new steel rails. The ledger showed the money routing directly to Meridian Supply. Meridian immediately wired 80% of the cash to an offshore holding company. The remaining 20% bought substandard, brittle scrap metal. The tramline failed within 5 years due to fractured tracks. The ledger revealed the exact mechanics of that failure. A recurring set of initials appeared at the bottom of the largest transfer orders. The letters were stamped in red ink. Martha cross-referenced these initials with old property deeds found at the bottom of the lockbox. The name was Arthur Vance Miller. He was the original owner of the building Martha now occupied. Miller had used this very basement as the nerve center for his embezzlement ring. The structure was not just an abandoned warehouse. It was the primary crime scene of a massive historical fraud. Miller had acted as the phantom conductor of the city's wealth. He approved the fake invoices. He stamped the forged authorizations. He directed the flow of public money into his private vaults. The paper trail ended abruptly in the winter of the 10th year, but the stolen wealth did not evaporate. It compounded over the decades. The phantom companies eventually merged and legitimized. They evolved into modern real estate conglomerates. The current developers attempting to push Martha out of the neighborhood were the direct financial heirs of Arthur Miller. The ledger was the missing link. It proved their entire corporate empire was built on a foundation of stolen municipal funds. The document transformed Martha's struggle from a simple property dispute into a historical reckoning. She now held the exact blueprint of their original sin. The ink was dry, but the debt remained unpaid. The deadliest strikes in a modern city rarely involve bulldozers. They arrive in plain white envelopes. A municipal seal replaces a physical weapon. A zoning citation functions as a silent eviction notice. Martha understood this reality on a cold Thursday morning. The water pressure in her subterranean shelter dropped to absolute zero. The utility provider cited emergency line maintenance. The repair crew never arrived. This was not a random infrastructure failure. It was a calculated opening move. The current stakeholders of the district recognized the threat buried in Martha's excavated archives. They did not send enforcers to confiscate the ledgers. They sent municipal inspectors. The first official wore a high-visibility vest and carried a laser measuring tool. He ignored the boxes of forged historical authorizations. He focused entirely on the ceiling height. He measured the distance between the primary egress and the ventilation shaft. The inspector applied modern residential building codes to a forgotten industrial bunker. Failure was mathematically guaranteed. By Friday, the first citation appeared taped to the reinforced steel door. It declared the space a severe biohazard risk. The document cited inadequate natural light and improper waste routing. The penalty was set at $500 per day. The fine was designed to double every 48 hours. The objective was never revenue collection. The objective was the manufacturing of a legal pretext. If Martha could not pay the fines, the city could place a lien on the property. If the property carried a lien, it could be seized under eminent domain for public safety. The historical theft recorded in Martha's found documents would be buried under a fresh layer of administrative concrete. The siege escalated rapidly. The local planning commission weaponized the city grid against a single address. Power fluctuations became a daily routine. Surges destroyed Martha's digital scanners. Complete blackouts lasted for 12 to 14 hours. The electric company blamed outdated local transformers. Yet, the newly constructed luxury lofts across the avenue remained brilliantly illuminated. Next came the isolation tactics. The Department of Transportation erected concrete barriers at both ends of the access alley. They cited a sudden need for subterranean structural testing. Delivery vehicles could no longer approach the site. Martha had to carry supplies by hand across 4 city blocks. Every trip exposed her to the elements and the watchful cameras of the adjacent corporate towers. This is the architecture of an invisible eviction. It relies entirely on plausible deniability. The aggressor never throws a punch. They simply tighten the regulatory framework until the occupant suffocates. The system frames the victim as a persistent violator of public safety codes. The oppressor wears the mask of a concerned civil servant protecting neighborhood standards. Martha attempted to file appeals. The bureaucratic labyrinth was perfectly designed to exhaust her remaining resources. The zoning board required a specialized structural engineering report to contest the initial citation. The certified engineers in the district were quietly discouraged from accepting the commission. Those who agreed demanded retainer fees starting at $10,000. The city demanded the installation of a commercial-grade sprinkler system. The estimated cost exceeded $50,000. The permit application for the installation required a signature from the original property owner. The original owner had been a shell corporation dissolved 70 years ago. The administrative framework operated as a closed loop. The Department of Health required a functioning water supply to lift the biohazard designation. The utility company refused to restore the water supply until the biohazard designation was lifted. This circular logic was not a flaw in the system. It was the system functioning exactly as intended. Every municipal department worked in silent concert. Fire marshals conducted unannounced inspections at 2 a.m. They demanded immediate access to verify the integrity of the fire suppression systems. They knew no such systems existed in the century-old bunker. Each visit generated a new report. Each report added another layer of legal justification for a forced removal. Martha was fighting a ghost. There was no single antagonist to confront. There was only a decentralized network of clerks, inspectors, and automated penalty systems. They were protected by layers of municipal code and union guidelines. The true power holders remained entirely insulated from the dirty work of displacement. The pressure began to degrade the physical environment. Without power, the dampness of the surrounding earth seeped through the masonry. Condensation threatened the fragile paper trails Martha had spent weeks excavating. The cold became a constant physical weight. The local authority was using the natural elements as an extension of their administrative power. Fighting the citations directly was a war of attrition she could not win. The paper trail of historical fraud was her only leverage. She needed to digitize the remaining ledgers before the dampness destroyed them. The siege was designed to break her resolve through isolation. Her survival depended on bypassing the local blockade and launching those documents into a much wider arena. A single sheet of paper can dismantle an empire. It only requires the precise calculation of its trajectory. Martha held a ledger dated 1982. The binding was decaying. The ink was brittle. The implications were absolute. She bypassed traditional media syndicates. She carried the physical evidence to Clara. She operated a decentralized investigative desk out of a repurposed industrial loft. Her team specialized in forensic data recovery and financial cryptography. They did not deal in rumors or anonymous tips. They required mathematical certainty. The verification process commenced immediately. Clara's team spent 4 weeks dissecting the physical archive in a climate-controlled environment. They utilized ultraviolet spectrometry to illuminate erased marginalia. They consulted retired state archivists to authenticate the faded municipal stamps. Every handwritten account number was meticulously cross-referenced with recently leaked offshore banking registries. The methodology was exhaustive. They matched the microscopic idiosyncrasies of typewriter ribbons to specific zoning offices operating in the 1990s. The lineage of the phantom wealth transfer slowly became visible. A shell entity, known as Vanguard Equities, held the title to Martha's block. Vanguard was a ghost. It possessed no employees. It maintained no physical address. It generated no legitimate commerce. Yet, it consistently absorbed millions in urban development grants. Clara tracked the encrypted tax identification numbers. They formed a perfect, closed loop. The funds flowed from the city treasury, washed through Vanguard's accounts, and deposited directly into the private family trusts of current zoning commissioners. The bureaucratic siege against Martha was not a routine code enforcement. It was a panicked, preemptive cover-up. The informational counterstrike launched on a Thursday morning. It was not a sensational broadcast. It was a surgical insertion of raw, verified data into the public domain. Clara published a heavily annotated, open-source database. She uploaded high-resolution scans of the forged authorizations. She mapped the illicit financial architecture using interactive, publicly accessible nodes. To ensure the integrity of the release, her team embedded a cryptographic hash into the files. This proved the documents remained unaltered. The primary server crashed within 45 minutes. Decentralized mirror sites instantly absorbed the global traffic. Independent researchers began downloading the archives. The information was permanently logged into the digital ecosystem. It could never be retracted or suppressed. The sequence of events was immediate and cascading. The silent administrative war against Martha halted abruptly. The aggressive building inspectors vanished from the property. Their department was suddenly paralyzed by internal panic and document shredding. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the district attorney announced an emergency press conference. The sheer volume of downloaded evidence eradicated any option for a quiet, backroom settlement. The state issued 32 subpoenas before sunset.